Hello and welcome to another episode of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. I'm at my mom's house with all my 80s toys, well, most of my 80s toys, in the background. And we have a family tradition called the Orange Carpet Film Festival, where we watch 80s movies from our childhood. We used to have an orange carpet in the 80s. There's my Skeletor and the skeleton transport, whatever that toy was called. Um, and one of the movies we're watching this time is Little Shop of Horrors, which is a fascinating study in the nature of changed endings and schematic shifting, which, clearly schematic shifting is one of my obsessions. Um, Especially if you compare the original film version from 1960 to the stage musical version, which my brother Bill was in when he was in high school, and the 80s musical movie version, which is the one that came later. Um, and the ending for each of those is a bit different. And I think that has a lot to do with the schematic shifting, um, partly because just the nature of the original Little Shop of Horrors, it was a horror comedy. It was a subversive horror comedy, and a lot of that might have to do with the era as well. What was more acceptable in film in 1960, or more common in low budget, obscure films like that, or Roger Corman movies, especially in the 1960s. Um, that has a more anticlimactic ending, sort of a quirky, subversive ending, where Seymour jumps into Audrey 2 and sort of kind of kills him from the inside out. Sort of ambiguous. But that's much more of just a wacky, subversive comedy. It's sort of a darker Jerry Lewis type of character with Seymour. Um, it's the sort of hero who you have some sympathy for, but he's sort of like probably the '90s equivalent would be Seinfeld characters, where they're deeply flawed and they're your protagonists, and to a degree you want to see them win, but to another degree they're so flawed that if they lose, they sort of have it coming. And that's one of the areas where, if you think about, if you make the false universal claim that all stories are either uh, moral tales of right and wrong, and you're attracted to tales that share your morals, a lot of Little Shop of Horrors is built on the idea that certain characters deserve to die, which would be a terrible thing in real life, and I would never, never condone that sort of attitude in real life. But if you apply it to a story like Little Shop of Horrors and you see certain characters deserve to die. Um, but the 1960s one had Jack Nicholson as one of his earliest, maybe his earliest, really subversive, wacky, crazy character. He's played a lot of characters like that, where he might be the protagonist, or he might be maybe not the protagonist, but one of the most compelling and fascinating characters easily. But you rarely ever, most Jack Nicholson characters, uh, with the exception of maybe, the iconic ones like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that sort of thing. You don't really want to see Jack Nicholson characters succeed, even though he's by far the most compelling and fascinating character in the whole movie, most of the time. Sort of like I was talking about with Roxy Hart. Roxy Hart's fascinating, but she's awful in so many ways. But she's compelling and magnetic, and it's uh, the awfulness of her is really compelling, and like the Seinfeld characters, that sort of wacky adventures of unrepentant reprobate who, and Seymour is not that awful. It's just he's exploiting this blood-eating plant, and so what he's doing is not something you would necessarily cheer for, but he's compelling and interesting to watch, and you want him to succeed. I mean, in the sense that you cheer for this downtrodden doofus. but you don't want him to necessarily kill people, defeat to the plant, and he doesn't want that either. He just sort of it steamrolls or it snowballs into that. Steamrolls. That's not the right word. Um, but if you compare that to the stage musical version that ends with just Seymour jumping into the plant's mouth and with a machete aiming to chop it to pieces from the inside. It's a very anticlimactic ending. Uh, Especially just the nature of a lot of the songs and the nature of a Broadway musical. I mean, that's a Broadway comedy, as opposed to something like Sweeney Todd or what have you. You definitely don't want to see Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd's very compelling and fascinating and magnetic. Magnetic. You don't necessarily want to see him succeed, although he's killing people who deserve to die. Something that you should never translate to real life, of course. Um, but it still feels anticlimactic and dissatisfying. And the 1980s movie version with Rick Moranis shifted that and translated it to be much more heroic ending. And that might be based on the era where that sort of action adventure heroic character was more common and expected. And the original version had Audrey breeding and growing into these giant monsters that destroyed cities and stuff like that. It's a glorious ending, but in terms of storytelling, it's unsatisfying. So why is that unsatisfying as a storytelling trope? Um, when you shift it from the very 60s typical quirky subversive comedy um, to, and I don't know if it's typical really, but it's much more in the vein of quirky comedies of the 60s. When you shift that into a Broadway musical, a musical comedy, a dark musical comedy, but still a comedy, you shift that into an 80s movie comedy. Part of the reason that's unsatisfying is the schematic expectation. So you set up Seymour as a much more sympathetic hero, not one that you necessarily in the vein of a Seinfeld type of character, where if they fail, they failed based on their own flaws. Um, the Rick Moranis Seymour is much more pathetic, and you cheer for him to succeed. And a lot of that has to do with his relationship with Audrey, which is ramped up. Like songs like Suddenly Seymour, it's really ramped up and heightened, um, partly due to just the schematic expectations of a Broadway show. Plenty of Broadway shows will take stories with a romantic uh, pair and ramp up the romance of it, to facilitate the romantic song or what have you. So Suddenly Seymour, songs like that, fairly typical for a Broadway show. But the emotions that communicates are not really typical for a subversive horror comedy. Um, and so, by the time you set up the emotional expectations of that sort of Broadway schema, um, and you heighten up the emotions with Suddenly Seymour, um, the intensity of the audience's expectations for Audrey one and Seymour to end up together, that renders that the failure of them to end up together more dissatisfying. Whereas if it was just more of a straight horror comedy, um, and if the characters were less sympathetic, then the ending would, a downbeat ending would be more satisfying. So it doesn't mean that one's right or wrong. It's just the nature of that story type renders one more satisfying than the other. And that's a case where, arguably, you don't always see this, but arguably, focus groups change that for the better. And part of the problem with workshopping is that it functions like a focus group where it normalizes things. And that can be fine. And I think that's a lot of where the false positives come in, where you take something that is quirky and experimental and outside of the norm. Like the original Little Shop of Horrors was definitely outside of the norm. You shift that into a different schema and you keep the same sort of downbeat ending. Um, uh, Something like a Broadway musical, a comedy musical, if it's outside of the norm, a focus group is going to let you see that. And in some cases, that's best for the story. And arguably, even though Plants Taking Over the World is glorious, arguably for Little Shop of Horrors, that was fine. That worked well. The heroic ending, although it's more cliched, it's more satisfying ultimately. Does that make it a better story? Yeah, arguably, that is a case when the focus grouping made it a better story. But focus grouping is not a universal solution to make things better stories, but there is a really common tendency to make them more normal stories. Framing Little Shop of Horrors in terms of Broadway musical and 80s monster movie, normalizing that particular case makes it more satisfying. But do we want to necessarily normalize all stories? So it can work, but it can fail terribly. Little Shop of Horrors is a case where arguably it did change it for the better. But anyway, that's my episode for today. I actually kept it under 15 minutes. That's a miracle. See you next time.